So let's dig into a particularly controversial one that we've alluded to a few times, which is about carbohydrate intake and insulin sensitivity. And we've talked about this before, but essentially there is this juxtaposition where low-carb diets cause the reliance of fatty acid oxidation and reliance on stress hormones, and those things block insulin sensitivity. They block our ability to use glucose effectively. On the flip side, increasing carbohydrates does the opposite. It actually increases our insulin sensitivity pretty significantly. And we see this not only in someone who's insulin sensitive, but even in people who have diabetes. And so we'll dig into a couple of papers here that essentially show this. And it's also worth mentioning here, and we won't go through these studies, but I'll cite them in the notes, that there's a lot of studies out there, a ton of them, showing no association between sugar intake or carbohydrate intake and insulin resistance. So even on kind of the more epidemiological level, or even controlled trials with those things, they don't support this notion that's been this ridiculously oversimplified notion, this carb-insulin model of obesity, that the more carbs you eat, the more insulin you produce, the more fat you store, the less insulin sensitive you are. It's just not what happens in the physiology. And it's very, very clear. And it's really unfortunate. It's really harmful that idea still circulates, still permeates, decades plus down the line. And honestly, in the alternative world is still the prominent theory that's being purveyed. So some major concerns there. So this paper is titled Effect of High Glucose and High Sucrose Diets on Glucose Tolerance of Normal Men. And they were basically looking at diets with different levels of glucose and then comparing that with sucrose. And so they state as the dietary glucose content was increased progressively, they started at 20% and then went to 40, 60, and 80% of calories, a gradual improvement of glucose tolerance occurred. And when normal subjects were changed from a controlled diet to one containing 80% of calories as sucrose, significant improvement in oral glucose tolerance occurred. These improvements in glucose tolerance were associated with slight reductions in plasma insulin levels. These studies demonstrate that short-term periods up to 10 weeks on a high sucrose diet lead to improvement of glucose tolerance in normal subjects. And what they were essentially finding was the most improvement on the sucrose diet, the high sucrose. Again, we're talking 80% of calories from table sugar, from sucrose, and this is in a liquid diet. All of these, they're using liquid diets for the non-controlled diets. And so what they found is that, again, insulin sensitivity continued to improve as you increase carb intake from glucose alone. And when you switched it from glucose to sucrose, meaning it contained fructose, then it was even better when it came to insulin sensitivity. And we'll dig into another study right after this showing that high carb diets also improve insulin sensitivity in people with insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes. But we've talked about the benefits of fructose in the past, and this also supports that, how much benefit there was in terms of glucose tolerance when you had the fructose component alongside the glucose. And these ideas that fructose is a toxin and a poison and all of that, which obviously this study suggests otherwise, but we've also gone through extensively in previous episodes why that is not the case, the issues with that research, why fructose doesn't increase uric acid to a concerning level or really at all, except in really extreme conditions. So I'll link back to those. We won't touch on that now, but it's just worth noting that if you were to change to an 80%, so an all liquid diet with 80% sucrose from the controlled diet that they had, you would see an increase in improvement in insulin sensitivity. So pretty dramatic findings here.
Yeah, basically what you're seeing is there's two things, more carbs and or I guess they kind of go together, but more carbs and lower fat is improving insulin sensitivity, improving the ability of the body to oxidize carbohydrate. And this was in normal men. Curious to see what happens when we get into diabetic individuals. But this is exactly what we're saying is as you lower fatty acid oxidation, and they're doing this through the diet, they're not using insulin, but as you lower fatty acid oxidation you increase, or you try to push an increase in glucose and glucose oxidation, insulin sensitivity improves as the cells improve their ability to actually oxidize carbohydrate.
Yeah, exactly. It's a very telling study here. And do you want to share the next one?
Sure. So this study is titled Improve Glucose Tolerance with High Carbohydrate Feeding in Mild Diabetes. So they start off, they say, to evaluate the effect of increased dietary carbohydrate in diabetes mellitus, glucose and immunoreactive insulin levels were measured in normal persons and subjects with mild diabetes maintained on basal, 45% carbohydrate, and high carbohydrate, which is 85% carbohydrate diets. fasting plasma glucose levels fell in all subjects, and oral glucose tolerance, 0 to 120 minute area, significantly improved after 10 days of high carbohydrate feeding. Fasting insulin levels also were lower on the high carbohydrate diet. However, insulin response to oral glucose did not significantly change. These data suggest that the high carbohydrate diet increased the sensitivity of peripheral tissues to insulin. So basically what they're showing here is that when they changed people, and this include diabetics, from a 45% carbohydrate diet to an 85% carbohydrate diet, their fasting plasma glucose levels fell, and their ability to actually tolerate a glucose challenge improved significantly just after 10 days on this type of diet. And so the other thing they're seeing is fasting insulin levels were also lower on the high carbohydrate diet as well. So what you're seeing is these people are requiring less insulin to keep their fasting blood glucose levels lower, and then they were requiring less insulin for a carbohydrate challenge to actually respond to the insulin effectively. And again, this isn't just about the sensitivity to insulin. What is this showing? This is indicating an improved ability for the cells to uptake and utilize carbohydrate. Because as we discussed in the previous episode, the ability of the cells to respond to insulin is dependent upon what's going on inside the mitochondria and with mitochondrial function. And I'm sure a portion of this also involves lowering glucagon, lowering glucocorticoids, as we talked about with some of the other mechanisms as well in this specific episode. So that's exactly what we want to see. And that's one of the strategies that we're talking about as being effective for improving insulin sensitivity and ability to oxidize carbohydrate is actually oxidizing the carbohydrate or increasing carbohydrate, not oxidizing or increasing fatty acids.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And alongside that, another part that you just mentioned at the end is the lowering of fatty acid oxidation, right? Also being huge here. Of course, if you're increasing carbs, I'm assuming that there was a pretty big decrease in fat intake as well. I'm assuming that they weren't actually consuming a 60% protein diet prior or 55% protein diet prior. So, so that's huge, right? 45% to 85%. This is the opposite of what most of the people out there are suggesting that you do when it comes to improving insulin sensitivity. And yet this is in people with mild diabetes. And you saw all of the most important markers, an oral glucose tolerance test, which is typically the gold standard, alongside lower fasting insulin and improvements in fasting glucose as well. I mean, that's exactly what we're looking for. So, that's, I think, pretty clear there in terms of the fact that as we increase carbohydrate intake, it actually supports and increases insulin sensitivity.
Yep.
And that brings us to the last area of evidence that we're going to touch on briefly here, which is showing that just like we see this in kind of pure insulin resistance, in other disease processes that are directly related, like cardiovascular disease and fatty liver disease, you also see increased fatty acid oxidation as a contributor. And this is happening even alongside the accumulation of fat, even alongside increases in body fat, increases in liver fat. And this is so important, again, something we didn't touch on directly earlier in terms of misconceptions and things like that. But this idea that burning more fat, in the cells means losing body fat is not accurate. There's some great Kevin Hall studies that show this clearly, where they have a low-carb diet, increased fat burning, lower insulin, and yet less fat loss compared to a high-carb diet with lower fat burning and higher insulin. And we see this here in the fatty liver state, where you actually see increased fatty acid oxidation and accumulation of fat at the same time. Those things are not mutually exclusive, and that's because of the metabolic derangement due to the issues with mitochondrial respiration. And so we see that here in these papers. The first one states excessive hepatic mitochondrial TCA cycle and gluconeogenesis in humans with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And they state approximately 1/3 of the US population has NAFLD, a condition closely associated with insulin resistance and increased risk of liver injury. Dysregulated mitochondrial metabolism is central in these disorders. Individuals with NAFLD had a 50% higher rate of lipolysis and 30% higher rate of gluconeogenesis. This fits in with exactly what we were saying before, elevated free fatty acids as a result of lipolysis and elevated gluconeogenesis as a result of the production of glucose at the liver. These are both being caused by stress hormones. And so we're seeing that clearly here. And as they state in the next quote, the strong association between intrahepatic triglyceride content and hepatic oxidative and anaplerotic TCA cycle activity demonstrates the induction of mitochondrial fat metabolism in response to lipid overload during NAFLD. Simultaneous induction of pathways of lipid accretion, oxidation, and gluconeogenesis heralds oxidative stress, loss of glycemic control, and potential damage to the liver during chronic hepatic steatosis. And so what they're saying here is essentially you have this which we described in insulin resistance. You have these different derangements going on together. The ones they highlight are lipid accretion, meaning that there's an increase in fat stores, there's an increase in fat storage, also lipid oxidation, meaning fat burning, and gluconeogenesis, both of those being the result of stress, creating all of this damage in NAFLD, and of course causing the exact same thing in insulin resistance, and that's why these things go hand in hand.
Yeah, and I think the really interesting piece here overall is that the liver has an increased response to an ability to be damaged when it's oxidizing large amounts of fatty acids. And you're seeing the problem in NAFLD is just this overload of fat. And like, how do we deal with all this fat? The liver cannot deal with all the fat. It can't oxidize through all of it. So it's like trying to burn it, trying to store it. And the biggest problem here, I think the reason that you brought this up is that the oxidation of fat and the overload of fat is central to the pathology. And that's the same thing that we're seeing in diabetes. And it's the same thing that we're seeing in obesity. And it's the same thing that we're seeing impaired glucose tolerance is this impaired ability or this over-reliance on fatty acid oxidation with then the impaired ability to actually oxidize carbohydrate. And and again, the problem is centralized inside the mitochondria and involves the variety of stress hormones, right? So glucagon, adrenaline, cortisol. And again, we've talked about this in depth in the fatty liver series, going through the mechanisms and highlighting fatty acid oxidation and also the stress hormones in this process. But the major point here to get across is that we are seeing the same pathology in fatty liver disease play out in diabetes, play out in obesity, play out in impaired glucose tolerance. And these same pathways are the pathways that are being upregulated in low carbohydrate diets and fasting and starvation plans that people are promoting now to solve these exact problems.
Right. Just increasing the pathology. And we had an extensive fatty liver disease series, an 8-part series that I'd recommend people check out, where we dug into the fact that the underlying problem there is an issue with mitochondrial respiration, with glucose metabolism. And that's what is underlying all these other things, just like insulin resistance, because they're essentially the same problem. One is just focusing on what's going on at the liver. But yeah, you see it very clearly. And in this next paper, they further describe this if you want to share this quote. It's a brief one, just kind of suggesting supporting the same idea.
So the paper is titled Lipid Oxidation Products in the Pathogenesis of Non-Alcoholic Steatohepatitis, which is fatty liver disease. That's a fancy word for it. They say in NAFLD, so fatty liver disease, both lipid oxidation and the citric acid cycle are enhanced, suggesting that hepatocytes try to counteract excess lipid by increasing the oxidation of that lipid. The higher production of reducing equivalents by lipid oxidation so that's a high amount of NADH and FADH2. We talked about this in the Randall cycle studies, causes an overflow of electrons through the mitochondrial respiratory chain, resulting in higher free radical generation. This may lead in turn to mitochondrial dysfunction with consequent progression of liver pathology. So this quote is excellent because this quote is basically saying exactly what we've been saying throughout this process, in that driving fatty acid oxidation creates an overproduction of reactive oxygen species inside the mitochondria. And that overproduction of reactive oxygen species, these damaging components, the smoke that gets produced in the engine, damages the engine, damages the mitochondria. And running this long term, prioritizing this long term, actually damages the mitochondria directly. And here they're saying that is what's contributing to the damage to the liver. Not to mention, and Jay, you actually have talked about this in our fatty liver series, is that if you load your liver up with a bunch of polyunsaturated fatty acids, and then you create a bunch of smoke inside the liver cells by running fatty acid oxidation, you're setting yourself up from a transition from just a fatty liver to now an inflamed liver, where you actually have the hepatitis portion of this that moves into cirrhosis. So the fatty acid oxidation is like this spark, this metabolic the smoke through the production of ROS. And this is why we don't want to drive fatty acid oxidation and prioritize fatty acid oxidation, and why lowering it is helpful, not just because fatty acid oxidation is impairing the glucose oxidation, but also because the fatty acid oxidation over the long term accumulates damage through producing this reactive oxygen species and this metabolic stress.
Yeah, exactly. It is a huge contributor to the pathology. This is why fat metabolism is for low energy needs, because again, like if you're I don't know if we're trying to keep the analogies going. If we're in a car and maybe we only need to get, we only need to go slowly, a small distance, we can get away with it. But as soon as you actually need a high metabolic rate and high ATP production, you end up with a ton of smoke, as you were saying. It's like the engine is working with a really low quality fuel that is great if it's like going really slow, or if we're in a starvation state and want to slow everything down to make sure we can survive. But if we're actually forced to rely on this, it causes major issues. So that's what we're seeing here. And they describe it very nicely, discussing the issues with the mitochondrial respiratory chain, the reductive stress, all of that. So as they were saying in those first two studies, the excess fatty acid oxidation is going on as a response to the pathology, and also as something that contributes to pathology. And then this next study, they state very clearly that despite all this increased fat burning, you're still getting an accumulation of fat at the liver, and most of that fat is coming from fatty acids. It's not coming from fructose, glucose. It's not coming from other substrate. It's coming from the fatty acids, despite all this elevated fat burning, which again suggests that just increasing fat burning to try to lose body fat or to try to improve these scenarios is totally missing what's actually going on, because you're just focusing on the one side of the equation, which is the fat burning side, and forgetting the fat accumulation side. And when you bring more fatty acids into the system, you're also increasing the storage of fat, as well as the increase in fat burning. And that's what we saw with that Kevin Hall study, where the high fat, low carb diet had more fat burning, but less fat loss. And so we see that here in this study titled Sources of Fatty Acids Stored in the Liver and Secreted via Lipoproteins in Patients with Non-Alcoholic Fatty Liver Disease. And this quote states succinctly, the goal of the present study was to directly quantify the biological sources of hepatic and plasma lipoprotein trialglycerols, which is triglycerides, in non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. Of the triglycerides, or fat, accounted for in the liver, around 59% came from non-esterified fatty acids, free fatty acids. Around 26% came from de novo lipogenesis, meaning from some other substrate like glucose or fructose, and 15% or 14.9% from dietary fatty acids. So what they're saying here is, of all the fat that's accumulating in fatty liver disease, 75% is coming from fat sources, from fatty acids, either from the diet, which was a smaller percent, about 15%, and 60% from the body's own fat tissue due to stress causing the release of fat. And 26% is coming from some version of carbohydrates that's being converted to fat, or presumably a bit of protein as well, or amino acids as well. But what we're getting at here is, despite all this fat burning, despite this idea that you're deficient in fat burning in this state, obviously it's not the case. We see elevated fat burning and elevated fat storage coming from the fats. This is not a fructose problem. It's not a carbohydrate problem. We discussed that extensively in the fatty liver series. And this being a big reason why is that fat is actually the source of fat in the liver.
Yeah, and I think what's really interesting here is that they're saying 59% of that is coming from the non-esterified fatty acids, that's not coming from your diet. That's actually coming from tissue stores, or from the fatty acids circulating around in the blood, which would, again, highlight the importance of stress hormones in this pathology, because those stress hormones are actually driving up the release of these fatty acids. So you're pulling all these fatty acids from stores, from tissues, from the blood supply, and the liver is trying to handle all these fatty acids. And the actual burning of the fatty acids, as we talked about in the previous quote, is inducing damage to the liver directly. So it's the stress hormones are essential or central into this specific pathology as well, it's really interesting to see. Again, these are all the same mechanisms that we're showing is causing the problems for insulin sensitivity, is driving fatty acid oxidation, driving the free fatty acid release, and that's through the different stress hormones, glucagon, adrenaline, and cortisol, and then the actual effects of fatty acid oxidation inside the mitochondria of the cell.
Exactly. And just to add a bit of clarification, the fat source is not necessarily from the diet. 15% of the total fat is, 60% is from the body's own fat stores. But as you're saying, that means stress hormones are involved here. And that doesn't mean that diet doesn't play a role. If you're eating a low carb diet, that will increase the stress hormones, including glucagon, that will increase the release of free fatty acids, which are the ones that the liver is taking up largely to produce fat. So the diet, of course, plays a huge role here. This doesn't exonerate fat in the diet. It's just saying that that's not necessarily the main source. Fatty acids are, but most of them are coming from the body's own tissues.
If you enjoyed that clip, you'll definitely want to download the free Energy Balance Food Guide.
The Energy Balance Food Guide will help you determine exactly what to eat to optimally support your metabolism and help you lose weight, improve your digestion, get amazing sleep, boost your energy, and so much more. The food guide makes it extremely easy to get started with a bioenergetic approach to optimizing your health. So head over to jfeldmanwellness.com/guide to download your free Energy Balance Food Guide.